I'm Rayvon Fouché. I'm a professor of American Studies at Purdue University, and I'm here in Richmond to talk about technology in sport and how it will shape our perception of sporting competitions in the future.
Let's hear it for Dr. Fouché.
Thank you, everyone, for making it out on an incredibly rainy day. And also, I have to acknowledge that I think Virginia's playing in a little bit, maybe, perhaps. So hopefully I'll be a good primer for the events to come. Again, I would like to begin by thinking about sport in relationship with technology. And my research is really invested in understanding we live in this deeply technological world where everything around us is mediated through our technological experiences. But when it comes to sport, we don't want to hear about it. We're not really excited about technology entering our sport. So let's begin with a phrase. It's the motor, not the machine. When I was an elite cyclist, this is probably 1989, 1990, and it was a phrase that my teammates, my friends, and I used to speak to each other. So maybe... I'm gonna, sorry, I feel a little uncomfortable talking into the microphone. So this is me in 1989, 1990, and this was me with my training partner. This person over here, his name is Chris Petty. He was probably the best cyclist I knew. He was on the national team for several years. And what's interesting to me about this is when I would arguably start thinking about the relationship between technology and sport. And you probably can't see it very well, but Chris is riding a really beautiful bicycle. It's a steel bicycle, elegant welds. I was deeply jealous. I'm riding one of the first pre-production carbon fiber aluminum welded bicycles made by the world's largest bicycle manufacturer, Giant. For a person of my size, I'm a huge, in a sense, for a cyclist. It was not that great. And I had deep jealousy over Chris's bicycle. But what mattered to me most that day, we had ridden to the race together, was what we were riding up. We were riding up this. And this is not in some far-off, beautiful place in, say, Belgium or France. It's in Burlington, Iowa. But it's called Snake Alley. And it rises about 300 feet in short distance. And we'd ride up 20 times, which is roughly 6,000 vertical feet of climbing. And what's interesting about that is I remember thinking, I really love your bike, Chris, but I don't want to drag it up this huge mountain. Well, it's not really a mountain. And that phrase, it's the motor, not the machine, was key to that experience. And that idea was my body, my lungs, my legs, was vastly more important than any kind of technological device, any bicycle, any piece of equipment, any pharmaceutical treatment that I was using or potentially could use in the outcome of the event. And arguably, we would say that out of our own hubris and clearly deep ignorance, but it was also a way for us to, in a sense, mollify our concerns about the coming technology. At that moment, early 90s, we're moving from steel to carbon fiber, we're changing things from wool and materials to elastane, and also, right, the coming drug culture was clear to everyone at that moment. So we were trying to figure out a way to understand and deal with that evolving world. But at the end of the day, Chris, who was, again, one of the best cyclists I knew, finished on the podium, and I was somewhere close, but not that close. So at the end of the day, right, the body did triumph the machine. So the research I do is really invested in looking at these four constituencies. Mainly, I'm interested in competitors, right? Athletes, and how they compete. And as we move into our current moment, the difference between elite level athletes is getting smaller and smaller. And so the place where you can garner the largest competitive advantage ends up in the world of technology or science. So I'm interested in technoscientific actors, kind of a long-winded way for saying the people that design, manufacture, and engineer the technologies that the athletes use. But of course, people can't use whatever they want. Their governing institutions, NCAA, FIFA, NASCAR, there are multiple governing institutions that determine what technology can and cannot be used. And oftentimes, they're very slow to react, and they only get very interested when the publics, right? Academics, fans, journalists say something is out of awry. And so I'm interested in this strange and uncomfortable equilibrium that they have together in balancing the place of technoscience or technology in the context of their sporting competitions. So I guess let me just get into a series of instances and cases where I'm going to try to convince you that we need to start paying more attention to the technology and the sports we love and play and embrace. So I'll begin with the easy case. This is Lance Armstrong, clearly. Over to your left is a slide of EPICs. These are the key blood-boosting drugs of the modern era. It's EPO. Athletes like Lance Armstrong, who argued he was tested roughly 500 times. Here's the infographic representing pretty much where he was tested, about 250 times. Arguably, we as a culture and society collectively agree that using performance-enhancing substances is probably not the best use of our time and effort and should be banned. But we have a perception that it's getting better. We're doing a better job with catching dopers and cheats. But arguably, I'm not sure we've reached that point. So this is March 1st, 2019, at the FAS World Championship, Max Hauck. It's probably hard to see, but what he's using is he's doing an intravenous blood transfusion of red blood cells to blood boost. And he's being caught by the Austrian police. And right, when you have a blood IV going into your arm at that moment, what do you do besides just look uncomfortable? So we're a long way from changing this world. So we're pretty clear about how that should be. But what happens when we think about other kind of things? So I think we're very clear on the concept of doping, but what happens when we think about other material objects? And these are the things I'm most interested in. So let's talk about starting, about track and field. Historically, when we think about starting, you have an individual, right, has a gun, and the starter looks down the start line to determine if anyone moves, because historically the understanding of what it means to false start was to make any movement before the starter gun goes off. Eventually, it was just initially a pistol, but now you see this example of this individual who has a pistol connected to a timing device. But around 2010, Omega starts developing an electronic device to allow us to move away from the traditional pistol and to do a better job at tracking events in sporting competitions. But what's interesting about this is that it's not only connected to the starter pistol, but it's connected to a new set of starting blocks. These are pressure-sensitive starting blocks that determines the reality of a start, meaning that what ends up happening is now with this new technology, a false start is that if you leave the starting blocks before too early in relation to the starting pistol. But what's important is that this has real material consequences. So here's the head of Usain Bolt. This is the 2011 World Championships, the 100-meter final. And I'll show a little clip in a second, but what ends up happening is Usain Bolt false starts and is disqualified. But if you look more closely, right about here in the video, you'll see his countryman, Johan Blake, twitch, and he false starts. So let's just watch this.
Oh no, the whole crowd will go.
Wow,
because that was Usain Bolt.
Massive disappointment.
That is one of the biggest shocks.
Usain Bolt, he's ripping his jersey off in frustration and disappointment. He's lost. So, but what's important is that since it's all managed through the technology, the data exists about what happened. So Up top, you have Walter Dix. In lane 5, you have Usain Bolt. In lane 6, Johan Blake. And what's interesting about it, now with the new starting devices, the argument is that a clean start has to happen 100 milliseconds after the gun is fired, because that's the time when people say that you can hear the gun and react physically. But what's interesting is that as you see the blue line, which is measuring the pressure on the pressure pads, they're moving the whole time. There's no such thing as, in a sense, a clean, simple false start. And I'm intrigued with the idea that now we've changed the idea or concept of starting from a starter with a pistol watching movement to now transferring that power and authority to a series of technological systems that determine when an athlete will move or not move. So I'm intrigued with what that means for the future of how we think about sport. All right, moving on, right. Here we have, I still like this image a lot, fully mustached, Mark Spitz, 1972, wearing his 7 gold medals, and then from 2008, Michael Phelps, wearing his 8 gold medals, right? In 2008, Michael Phelps eclipses Mark Spitz's record of Olympic medals by winning 8 gold medals in an Olympic competition. But for me, when I think about technology in sport and equipment, I'm drawn to the briefs. Not necessarily the mostly form-fitting stars and bars briefs that Mark Spitz is wearing, but the extremely tight briefs that Michael Phelps is wearing, and thinking about the technology that goes into that. Because we make it a strong effort to compare the two, but in many ways, they're not really comparable. Because in several events, Michael Phelps wore this. And this is not just a benign piece of equipment. This is the Speedo laser racer. So this is the introduction of the suit in the spring of 2008. For the previous 20 years, Speedo and other swimsuit manufacturers had been making a strong concerted effort to build suits that allowed swimmers to swim more faster and efficiently through the water. Technologically, what they're pretty much doing is disciplining the fleshiness of bodies and turning them into literal swimming torpedoes. So you hear the stories about the suits taking 20 or 30 minutes to get on. They really do take that long because they're delicate, but if you're trying to squeeze someone's body into the tightest formation possible, it's very difficult. So when Speedo creates this suit, they knock it out of the park. Pretty much in 2008, if you weren't wearing a suit like this, you weren't competitive. And opposed to banning these suits, FINA, the governing body of swimming, they kind of opened the floodgates because they said, and we're excited with the performances athletes had using this suit. So what ends up happening is in the next year, 2009, you get full body, sleeve to ankle suits made out of full polyurethane. So if ever watching the events at this moment, you see athletes pulling their suits out, puffing them full of air, closing them back so they can float higher in the water. In the 2009 World Championships, just short of 50 world records were broken in that one World Championship event. And, right, the publics come in. Because at this moment, it became less about the athletes, in a sense, Michael Phelps' wingspan, the size of his feet, whatever. It became about what suit, what individual was wearing, and what products it was manufactured out of. They ended up banning the suits, but it made a very important kind of representation of how athletes can use equipment to change performances. But the idea of using a full body suit is nothing new. So this is Kathy Freeman winning the 400 meter finals at the 2000 Sydney Olympic Games. We have Allison Felix in 2011 in Nike's newest suit. And what I love about the interviews with the people designing this suit, they said this suit is faster than skin. So the idea that you want to package someone in a material that's faster than skin, but that's okay, in the sporting competition is strange to me because shouldn't you run in your skin? But I guess not. And the thing is, these technologies were completely legal and available. But before we get too far down the line of thinking that the technology is only happening in the modern era, we should go back to here. So This is the 4x100 meter English gold medal team from 1912. And if you don't have to look too hard to realize the suits they're wearing are amazingly thin, 1 to 2 ounces, and you can pretty much see straight through them. And I love this image because the women are such a stark contrast to the very dour woman in the middle, who's covered from neck to toe. But from my perspective, there's only one reason you wear a see-through silk swimsuit, is you want to be fast and win. So I love this image because it says a lot about women in sport. At the time, they're only allowed to race in the 100 because they didn't think women could swim any farther, which, of course, is just ridiculous. But it makes us think really deeply about the place of costumes and swimsuits and technology in sport. I'll move on to shoes. I'm fascinated with athletic shoes. I'm one of the firm believers that athletic shoes are totally performance enhancing. If they didn't work so well, people would all play sports in bare feet, but no one does. But I'm interested with this individual. So this guy's name is Adolf Dassler. His friends called him Adi Dassler, or Adidas, or in the United States, Adidas. So you see his 3 stripes. And what's interesting about this shoe is that this is probably 1953, early 54, when he's developing a shoe for the West German team in the World Cup. Coming up into the World Cup, West Germany had been doing okay, but the dominant team in the world was Hungary, blowing people out. Previously in the World Cup, Hungary beat West Germany, I believe, 9-3. But what's interesting about this image is that in the finals, it starts to rain, really heavy. And Dassler develops a shoe where you can remove the cleats from the bottom of the shoe. And at halftime, he put these longer cleats on the shoes of the West Germans, and they dominated the second half, win the 1954 World Cup, and in a sense create a modern unified Germany. I don't know if I go along with all the bits of the story, but arguably the shoes mattered. They impacted the final outcome of the game. But similarly, Dassler created a pair of shoes, these shoes on your right, for Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympics. And in thinking about Owens, he lands in Germany, he meets Dassler, very short period of time, and he decides to change from shoes that he's been wearing pretty much his whole career to this pair created by Adi Dassler. And again, the only reason you are changing the shoe manufacturer at that moment in time is because you believe this is something better and more effective. And clearly, it probably was. So I'm moving to this shoe now. Does anyone know this shoe? Has anyone seen it? No. So this is the one shoe that has been banned by the NBA. So in 2010, APL, Athletic Propulsion Labs, the name will make sense in a second, created this shoe called the Concept 1. The NBA banned it because they believed it gave players a legal advantage. So as you see in this infographic right here, this was the sole of the shoe. There are 2 plastic plates with a spring inside. You step down, compress the spring, and jump up, and launch and load. And as you can see from their data, 11 of 12 athletes using the shoe jumped higher. I'm not sure what happened to athlete 9, who couldn't jump higher with the spring-loaded shoe. I've yet to be able to meet that person, but I'd love to have that conversation. But what's interesting about the shoe is that the NBA banned it. High school associations banned it nearly immediately, but as soon as the NBA banned it, they crashed this company's website because so many people were interested in buying and trying the shoe. So early 2011, high school associations started to unban the shoe because part of the argument is that if you look at the data, people are jumping an inch too higher. In a complex game like basketball, maybe jumping an inch may not make that big of an impact in the game. So for me, it's interesting that they would ban this shoe, but we're not so interested in banning some other lightweight shoes. All right, so moving to the last bit about shoes, and I'll let you all go after. I'll let the shoe thing free. I'm obsessed with shoes, obviously. So this is Lisa Desese, Eliud Kipchoge, and Zizurni Tadesse, three of the greatest marathoners on the planet at the moment. And in 2017, Nike decided to create an event to see if they could take these three athletes and have them break the 2-hour marathon barrier. Similar to breaking the 4-hour mile by Roger Bannister, it was a time that seemed to be hard to reach. And Nike initially presented this heartwarming personal interest story of seeing the limits of human capability, but in reality, sorry, I know there's going to be sound, but this is them promoting their technology. In a sense, using the bodies to express their technoscientific, arguably genius they felt. What's interesting about this is it's all about the shoe. And as you see these athletes running with this specially designed custom shoe. All right, and this is the shoe. It's called the Nike Zoom VaporFly Elite. Not too wordy, huh? What's interesting about the shoe is that most elite running shoes return energy at about 40 to 60% rate. Studies have shown this shoe the return of energy is about 87%. So a huge leap. They developed a special foam that allows for a higher energy return. And if you look through this crease right here, there's a carbon fiber plate that's specifically designed on the running motion of each individual athlete. So these are the most potent custom running shoes possible. And what's interesting also is that this elongated piece at the end has been designed that way because they found that the shoe could be much more aerodynamic with the tail end like that. So now we're talking about really spending a lot of time, money, and energy to develop a marathoning weapon. Eliud Kipchoge runs 2 hours, 25 seconds. Fastest recorded marathon ever, right? Clearly, the 2-hour marathon is in reach. The second in mile, he's there. But what's also interesting is after this, Eliud Kipchoge goes off on a tear of dominating marathons around the world wearing those shoes. So clearly he's very talented, but those shoes help a significant, help significantly in his ability to perform. All right, so I've talked about some examples of technology and how we can think about them kind of clearly and simply, but oftentimes these things can be easily dismissed. It's like, well, Kipchoge is really fast, Phelps is really fast, talent overcomes all. But what happens when we present some technologies that may be a little harder to dismiss? So we've got Oscar Pistorius. Runs the 2012 Olympic semifinals. He finishes last. He's interesting, but he's not fast enough to challenge the ways we think. However, athletes like Blake Leeper potentially are. In 2018,
I can't look it back at somebody and compare. So the only way I know at the end of the day that I'm doing a good enough job is when I'm on the track and I'm running as hard as I can till I throw up. Or I'm running as hard as I can till I can't breathe, till I give 120% physically.
he ran the 12th fastest 400-meter time of anyone on the planet. And Leeper says he's just about to hit his prime. So the question is, what happens and how are we going to understand athletes like Blake Leeper? But this question about prosthetic limb-wearing athletes gets very interesting when we talk about this individual, Marcus Ream. So in 2015, hopefully we'll see Marcus jump. This is him at the 2015 International Paralympic World Championships, where he jumps his personal best and a world record, 8.4 meters. And the 8.4 meter mark is really important because that would have won gold at the last 3 Olympic Games. 8.4 meters would have put him on the podium at every modern Olympics since they were reorganized. So now we have to ask these bigger questions that I'm really interested in, is that when someone like Marcus Ream does something incredible, will we appreciate and love him the same way we think about Bob Beamon jumping nearly 2 feet beyond the existing world record in 1968? I hope we are at this point that we will be able to embrace athletes like that, but I'm concerned that we might not be able to fully do that. All right, so last 2 bits, moving away from the gloom and doom, I'm interested also in how technology can potentially change the way we understand sports and give us a lot of opportunities. So this is a company that's rethinking helmet design. What they're trying to do is develop a helmet design that instead of making the helmet hard, they're making the helmet soft. And by making it soft, it compresses and flexes. And I'm currently teaching a course on technology in sport. And when I showed this in class, one of the women in my class, who's a softball player, texted her brother immediately and asked him, what do you think about that helmet? And he texted her back and said, I would never wear that because it would make me look soft. So in many ways, we are going to get into a place where we can have technology that may fundamentally change our ability to compete, but are we ready as a society to embrace letting go things like masculinity, power, and all the other things that reshape our technological world and space? All right, so with that, I would like to end by saying, when we think about evolution of technology in sport and where it needs to go in our future, we need to have a conversation about not it's the motor over the machine, or the motor is more important than the machine. It's the motor and the machine. How do we understand the relationship between our evolving technology, our societal needs and desires about play and games, and what does it mean to think broadly about the ways in which we understand sporting and sport in a global and changing technoscientific world? So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
I'm launching a sports brand myself, so
Yeah.
the thought process behind these companies, is it for the material more or for the athlete? Because it's like, I'm just trying to figure out what should be my approach when I'm trying to come up with a unique idea for my brand to set myself apart from the other brands.
Yeah, I think it's complicated because, right, all these brands are developing technologies to compete and show that they're forward-thinking, sophisticated brand, but it's also about winning. So you have to understand, it's not just about the athletes winning. The engineers, the designers, the scientists, they're just as competitive as anyone else. So it's all about trying to figure out how to push the limits of the technology to change the way in which we think about playing sports. So the people behind the scenes, they're just as prideful and happy about when athletes wearing the things they've created and designed win as well. So I think it's this symbiotic relationship between the equipment, the designers, and the athletes themselves.
I came across an article actually yesterday, I think, about senior athletes. And I want to say, not that I have anything specifically interesting about senior athletes, but it was about a 100-year marathon runner and somebody else. And so I wonder whether you've looked at how technology would allow people getting into 40s, 50s to continue sports, because that creates a significant societal impact in terms of people being healthy. So I just wonder whether there's any evidence, or have you looked at that aspect of technology?
Well, I guess I have two one anecdotal and then one kind of more science technology based, is that one of the big places where the doping movement is happening, at least in endurance sports, is with people who are 40, 50, 60 years old. Obviously, right, there's no drug testing, there's a lot of pride, and
A lot of money.
yes, so there's a lot of that happening. But the question, right, is a lot of the tension around sport and technology is, right, youth. So sport seems to be a youthful thing. So how do we allow people to play longer, play stronger, play more effectively? And part of the question is, when bodies start breaking down, do we go to the traditional method of, hip replacement, knee replacement, all the different forms of replacement, or what kind of treatments are available to think about that? So a lot of things I've been looking at and been interested in, at least around the context of aging, is how can we have that conversation about how an athletic body will look at 40, 50, 60 when athletes are in their 20s, rather than waiting for someone to be 50 years old, like I am about to be in several months, and your body starts breaking down and asking, how do I maintain my strength and ability? I think it in the realms of kind of pharmaceuticals and other kind of technologies, but there hasn't been much effort to focus on, I would say, my perspective, on athletes, people want to continue their athletic traditions as they get older, right? So some people have said, at least in the context of running, that we need to change the shoes. So like Hoka is using seemingly a larger padded shoe to allow people to run in a softer way. But the question is, how can we make an environment where the bodies can withstand the pain, the suffering, and the pressure longer?
The point you made about the helmet was very intriguing in that it would be a matter of choice, but it's sort of a tail wagging the dog. Is it the governing bodies of these different sports industries or are driven by the performance manufacturers? So I guess there's a distinction between safety and performance improvement. What's your experience been around how cooperative are the governing bodies when there's improvements for safety, like the helmet, but they could mandate that helmet in the NFL rather than have it as a choice. And then the performance suits, they were banned.
Yes.
Because, so is it the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail?
Well, I guess I don't want to speak on all football and all football fandom, but right, the perception of what football is has been changing very quickly in the past. Right, I grew up in a world where heavy hits, pain and suffering were the central part of football. And you look back on some of the early Monday night football advertising, and there are some scenes of two helmets slamming together, exploding. They don't do that anymore. But right, from my perspective, what gets the governing bodies or institutions to act is public outcry. And at this moment, at least in the context of football, I don't know if there's as much public outcry as I would like to see. And football, arguably, is struggling across the United States at the youth level. But I don't know if it's about parents and families, right? I spent a little bit of time in Upper Peninsula, Michigan, and I know some of the high schools there are getting rid of their football programs, but it has nothing to do about pain and suffering. It's potentially about the expensive insurance to fund football programs. So I don't know. I wish we had the will to say that we don't want to continue to see young people hurt and suffering over long periods of time. But I don't know how we change a sporting culture that's been built from around pain and suffering. Because if you look back at football, early in the 20th century, people were dying, and the Yale-Harvard games. So when we think about it, it's built around this kind of culture of masculinity and pain and suffering. So how do you extract that from that world? As you can see, it's extremely difficult.
Dr. Fouché, enjoyed your talk. A couple of questions. First of all, as far as the data being available, I know you mentioned like Speedo and Nike. Is there research publicly available so you can search and read the data and understand why it's performing so well for the new technologies that they're putting out?
Yeah, so generally, bits and pieces of data available. As you can imagine, they're not really all that excited about freely of making their data available. So there's scientists who have access to early studies. So probably the best data set that I've been able to see is about these swimsuits. So there were, at least particularly the laser razor in a whole section of swimsuits were produced by this group of academics and researcher at Speedo and Mizuno in Japan. And they published a ton of their research on the dynamics of dragging bodies through water. But overall, a lot of the data is housed internally because most of the people doing the work, it's about producing an efficient suit, and they're under really strict timelines. So it's not directly driven by an academic perspective. So there are a handful of research laboratories around the country that are doing that kind of work. So right now, I showed the example of Blake Leeper. He's working with a group of scientists at the University of Colorado to prove that his prosthetic limbs do not give him an unfair advantage. And I'm totally interested to see how this science and the data plays out, because how do you prove that your prosthetic limbs perform equally to limbs that you never had? That's a very strange kind of conversation. So some bits and pieces of data are available, but overall, I wouldn't say there are large kind of data sets or people making them readily available for people to examine and study.
Okay. And I think you answered my second question. I was going to ask what other universities or private labs might be doing research, and I'm assuming Purdue has some activities since you're at that university.
We're trying to begin some things, but I would say probably most major universities around the country have a small sports studies group doing various different kind of research and work. But I know that Blake Leeper is working with Colorado, and I think from my perspective and me interested in prosthetic limbs, that's where I find some of the most interesting research. Hopefully that'll be published in the near future, but we'll see.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fouché, for your presentation. I am wondering about the socioeconomic implications of all of this. I know that sports have always been, if you can afford the better coaches, the better equipment, it's always been an advantage. But this seems to be a bigger jump in terms of advantages given and the rich getting richer. I'm wondering if anyone has thought about this or looked into socioeconomics.
Well, at least in the context of swimming, the socioeconomics were a big deal because the suits were extremely expensive. And so the early laser racers, they were saying, I think it was 3 to 5 wears. Yes, 3 to 5 wears. And I think when they hit the market initially, they were above $500 a piece. So, right, if you're a Speedo-sponsored athlete, it's easy for them to just provide the suits for you. But when they started reaching the mass market, there was this tension. You would see kids showing up, 14, 15-year-old swimmers with these elite suits, and you knew they were going to swim faster than everyone else. So there was this financial barrier. So there's always this, for me, this economic tension within the context of sport. I have a 16-year-old son who's an elite soccer player, and I remember when the soccer cleats broke the $300 barrier. And this is a kid who, at a certain age, he's going through shoes every 2 or 3 months, and they really last about 4 months, the rate he plays. And there's a reason why you see so much soccer activity happening in the suburbs of every major metropolitan area in the United States. Sport is a business, and it has complicated socioeconomic implications, right? You hear right now the financial reality of what's happening. So in the recent news, Nike is evidently paying young athletes to wear their shoes. Late last year, a handful of people at Adidas were convicted for paying young athletes to wear Adidas shoe brands. So I don't know how we extract the realities of the inequities of sporting competition in a world that's driven by competition, whether it be athletic, financial, or otherwise. Do you have any ideas about how we can change?
So I'm a high school teacher. Ooh, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm a high school teacher, and I actually posed this question to my classes recently, and they still have an inherent view of fairness and the idea that if you work harder, you will be more successful.
Yeah.
And it kind of just broke my heart a little to tell them, it's not true. They're juniors in high school, and I also posed the question to them about, well, if these legs are getting more efficient, what's to keep people from cutting off their own legs, putting on these prosthetics, then competing and working really hard still? And I was comforted that most of them were not for that. There was a couple of students that I was, we had really good conversations about it, but the idea of fairness, I think, is still inherent in humanity.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that if things are public and maybe the research is made more available, and again, I don't know, unfortunately, if you work really hard, that you still might not succeed. It's hard to face students and young people and tell them about, situations and advantages.
Yeah, so my biggest thing about sport is it's not about fairness.
Yeah.
It's not about equality. It's about maintaining and sustaining the largest competitive advantage for as much time as possible, legally or illegally. And I like, at least at the elite levels, right? We like to believe that it's about fairness, but it's not about fairness, right? The NCAA basketball game championship game is gonna happen tonight, and there's gonna be a moment where a small player is matched up against a bigger player, and the bigger player is gonna take the shot. It's not about equality and balance. It's about exploiting weaknesses. And to the question about cutting off people's legs, that's why I'm totally fascinated with people like Marcus Ream, is that are we going to watch the best human performance, able-bodied performance, or are we going to watch the best performance? And we're at that moment where, at least within prosthetic limbs and other athletic competitions, we are pushing that limit. But I don't know. Arguably, when we watch elite level sports, I don't know if we're watching the best human performance anymore, right? We cheered Lance Armstrong for a very long period of time, and he had the best science behind him. Michele Ferrari, Francesco Cocconi, the people that were really revolutionizing how to study human performance using a series of very potent drugs. But I think we like to believe in fairness. We like to turn on the TV and watch sporting competitions and believe that it's all equal and balanced, but it's not.
So the way that you're talking about the technology piece of this is making me think about nuclear weapons, so bear me out.
I'm game for the ride, let's go.
So back in 60s, 70s, 40s through the 60s and 70s, as nuclear weapon technology started to evolve, because I was thinking about the engineers and the physicists who built that technology, right? And so there were debates about whether or not engineers and physicists had any responsibility to sort of weigh in and use their professional expertise. And there were physicists like Richard Feynman who said, no, we could make anything and how people use it is up to them. And there were folks like Science for the People, right, who said, no, we really have to pay attention to what we're making and how it's used. And so I guess my question is there any role for scientists and or engineers in this debate kind of publicly? Because you said it has to happen from the public. The public has to push back. But is there any maybe professional role for scientists and engineers to kind of shape this conversation?
Yeah, I consider scientists and engineers part of the publics as well. So they're not out of that part in making. But I think the tension, I think you're right on to that tension around the nuclear weapons, right? Because, there are a lot of scientists who are like, we detonate this bomb, we're going to annihilate the humanity, and I want to be there and watch it. So I think it's similarly, that you have scientists and engineers who are trying to see the technical and material limits of what they can do. How can they improve the human body to its logical conclusion? But of course, then there are people who are like, well, how can we use our ability to change how we compete in sports? I mean, I think, yeah, they have a responsibility, but that doesn't mean some of them will take on that responsibility. And it's a question when we realize that the products they designed are financialized in a way that nuclear weaponry was not. There's incentive. Well, I mean, but right, there's not a Nike nuclear bomb, right? And there's no. But I mean, it is financialized in a way that helps promote this idea. And I would argue that the competition for producing the nuclear bomb and nuclear weapons was just as similar to it was. I would say it's akin to what was going on in swimsuit design, because 2008, Speedo released the laser racer, and Michael Phelps is tremendously fast. But what ends up happening in 2009, a series of other companies produce suits that are even faster. So Phelps starts losing in 2009, and his coach and other people flip out and started saying, we need to change the world because Bob Bowman has a quote, something like, the man who puts butts in the seats is not winning, so we need to change this. So I don't know if that specifically answered your question, but I think it's similar to that tension about, so what are responsibilities of the people designing the equipment and the potential outcome of the sporting competitions? And right, this is interesting for the prosthetists, right? So roughly it's the same carbon fiber leg that was designed, a few decades ago that's being used, but there will be a new evolution of that.
So this is your area of expertise or research. I'm just curious, what is your personal opinion on what should be the limits of technology in sport, whether it's elite sports, college sports, junior sports, elementary sports? Should it be, on the one hand, small L libertarian, the sky's the limit, if you got the money to pay for it, go for it, versus there should be strict rules of what's allowed, what's banned, and then when you start getting into what's banned, then who can get away with cheating around that ban?
Yeah. Not to sidestep the question, but I don't know if I have a specific answer or recommendation, but I want us to have a conversation about it. And it can't be a reactive conversation to, say, a sport governing body sees a technology that people are upset with, so they're going to get rid of it. And then we move on and wait till the next thing appears, and then we get rid of it and move on. We're at a point right now where I think we need to have a collective conversation about what we want sport to be. And right, this is in thinking about the question about football. Do we want football to be what it is and how it's played? And right, if you watch the last NFL season, there's been a lot of conversation about, quarterbacks not getting hit. And what does that mean for the evolution of the game? And it runs up against these tensions of history and tradition. But sports have always evolved. And where do we get to the point where we think about the next step in the evolution of sporting competition? And it's always been technological. But I don't know where the limits are. And I think they change continually. Yes.
Have you heard of the the Starberry shoe?
Ah, yeah, the Stephen Marbury Starberry shoe.
Yeah, I heard a story about this recently. So
yeah.
The idea is that this is an affordable basketball shoe made by Stephen Marbury so that more kids have access to these shoes. Yeah. And it's just as good as your $100 plus basketball shoe, but it didn't sell well because it was seen as this cheaply made shoe, and therefore is cutting corners. So
yeah,
do you see research done in areas where people are trying to make materials that are affordable and can be produced on a mass scale, but they have to teeter on this line of well, we still want people to want it and buy it?
Yeah, so I would say that the Starberry was actually rather successful. It was the Shaq tried to do a similar thing, and the Shaquille O'Neal shoe didn't sell very well. But Starberry was sold at Dave and Barry's, the T-shirt company. And it actually sold very well. And people liked it. Young kids liked it because it was cool. And I don't know what happened with the industrial designers that they made that shoe that people wanted. And it sold fairly well. But arguably, yes, the Starberry shoe and Stephen Marbury, that's such an outlier. Because, right, the analog to that is Big Baller Brand and the Zo2s or not LeVar Ball, his son, Lonzo, thank you. So the analog to that is now creating a brand where it's about selling shoes at $500 rather than saying, yes, Stephen Marbury, his argument was that when I was a young player, I couldn't afford the most expensive shoes, so I'd love to have a shoe that people loved and wanted to wear for their ability to play. And I know a little about the Starberries because my nieces who don't play basketball, when they were released, had Starberries. So two, non-athletic girls getting Starberries, they must be kind of cool.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you so much.